once it's loaded, I try to put it in presentation mode and then zip over. Display settings, work presenter. So maybe it will do. I don't know.
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm watching the Windows logo.
That's nice. It's not quite what you meant to watch.
There you are.
Now?
Yeah, that's the presentation. Yeah.
Yeah, nice one. Good. Let's see if I can move it. Yeah, I can move.
Yep. Perfect.
Does it look okay to you, or do you see the kind of notes side, the kind of presenter?
No. It's totally presentation mode. That's it.
All right. Finally, just in time.
Okay, one more minute, and then I'm gonna make the introduction. Okay.
Sounds fair.
And then we can start around 1:25 when I finish your CV. Really?
As long as you leave me 5 minutes to talk, it's fine.
Yeah.
No.
Okay. Just let me go through my notes and there you go. Yes, perfect. Okay, I'm gonna start now in order to save time for questions. Okay, welcome everyone that is joining us on this first seminar of the term. I'm glad to introduce Dr. Miriam. I'm always have problems, you know, with the pronunciation of your last name. Is Koschate?
Yeah.
Yeah, is that okay? Koschate-Reis. With Miriam, Miriam, who is joining us. And I'm gonna do a short presentation of herself. And Miriam has a PhD in psychology by the University of Koblenz, Landau, Germany. She has worked for and in collaboration with leading experts such as Uli Wagner, Rolf von Dijk, Anja Eller, and Mark Levin. Miriam is now a senior lecturer at the Department of Psychology at Exeter University, where she is a theme lead for computational social science at the Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence. Let me allow this one. For the last 3 years, Miriam has been an EPSRC Innovation Fellow, as well as co-investigator on grants from EPSRC and MRC. Her current research focuses on the use of computational methods to better understand social identities in the natural world and their long-term effects on mental health and well-being. Rumors say that she created a robot that keeps monsters, ghosts, and goblins away from children's room, right?
Definitely.
No. Okay. Yeah.
Excellent. Oh, I wish I had done that, but I don't think I did.
So I'm gonna leave you with Miriam, and then we're gonna come back at minus 15 for questions and answers. Okay. Thank you, Miriam, for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's such a privilege, and to open the seminar, that's quite exciting. So I'm a little nervous about that, but hopefully I can tell you something interesting about what we've been doing in my lab. And do feel free to ask in between if you have any kind of questions to clarify. It's a little bit unusual stuff, I think, for psychology. It's sort of fairly new area in the social sciences. So I perfectly understand if people have questions, and hopefully lots of them. And I hope I'm not going through it too quickly. I did take out a little bit compared to the abstract just to keep enough time for questions, but I'm happy to kind of, if people have questions about something that I didn't mention, to tell you more about it. So yeah, to get started, what we do in my lab is we use natural language, so any kind of written text, really. We use a lot of social media data, but it could be any text, to understand social identities. And I'll try to tell you sort of what that looks like in practice. If the slides move, that would be even better. Does it move for you? Earlier it did move, now it moves. Good. So I give you a little bit on the background, which really is the question, can we tell who you are from the style in which you are writing? So that's the kind of big thing that we are promising to do, which seems a little bit crazy, perhaps. So I will tell you a little bit about identity salience and how we came up with the idea. I tell you a little bit about natural language processing, but not too much because I don't want to bore you. And also about how we develop the method that we're using to detect identities in linguistic style, which is if you put the kind of first question in slightly more scientific terms. Then I will show you how we use that to look at how people develop new identities. So one of the prime examples is perhaps how you develop a parent identity when you're pregnant for the first time. When does it happen? If you ask people, they can't really remember when they first thought of themselves as a parent. Was it when you held the child? Was it when you were planning for the child? Was it somewhere in between? Or maybe never? And how does that relate to mental health outcomes? And then I will say something about the work by one of my PhD students who looks at identity switches. So this is really kind of very fine-grained switches, things that happen within milliseconds. And she's looking at how effectively can we change from one identity into another identity, and can we control it? And then we also use linguistic style to look at groups and what groups stand for. What are the kind of values that define groups? And can we say something about groups that change over time? Does their linguistic style also change over time? Are these two things related? And then we can maybe discuss, is that actually a good idea to do these things? Does it open up new data sources? So linguistic text in any kind of shape or form, written text, perhaps speech text. And does it give us any new insights that we didn't have before on social identities in a kind of valuable and maybe even practically usable way? So that's the kind of things that I'm trying to get you through in about sort of 30, 40-ish minutes, maybe even 45, depending on. And the first thing I'm going to sort of introduce in a way, and it's just a picture really, is a little anecdote, because in a way it has changed what I'm doing. So as Salvador said, I started on intergroup contact, working with Uli Wagner and Anja Eller and other people. And then I started working with Mark Levine, and we met people who are very techy and do all sorts of crazy cool stuff with tech. And that completely changed my career trajectory to what it is now. And whether that's a good thing or not, the jury is out there, but it definitely was a big change. And it came about with one little anecdote that one of the colleagues in computer science told us. And what they did was they created a tool that can detect pedophiles, essentially, in online chat forums. That's their aim. So what they're doing is they try to detect the gender and the age of the person chatting. And if the person claims to be a 12-year-old girl and tries to chat to other 12-year-old girls or 9-year-old girls, but actually their tool detects that it's a 57-year-old man, then sort of alarm bells start ringing. So that's the kind of idea of that tool to protect children. And what they told us as an anecdote was that they pitched this new thing that works really well in the lab and also with natural data. And they pitched it to a businesswoman, and she kind of tried it out, this little tool. And what happened was that they couldn't tell. They couldn't tell her gender to start with. The age group was okay, but the gender, they just couldn't tell. And as social psychologists, we said, well, that's maybe not so surprising, because maybe the gender was just not very salient in that moment. Maybe it was not active. Maybe she didn't think of herself as a woman in that moment. Maybe she thought of herself as a business person, because that's what you were there for. So that would be just adapting to the context, wouldn't it? And they said, oh, we've never heard of that. Tell us more. And we told them about social identity salience. So that's what I'm going to do with you as well. And that got us into this kind of research, really, to start thinking about, can linguistic style change when we change our identities? And does it tell us something about the identity that a person has in a particular moment? Does it change that much that you can really actually say that person thinks of themselves as a business person and not as a woman in that moment? Is it that extreme? So social identity salience is the idea that's kind of going back to the 80s, that you have lots and lots of group memberships that you're a part of. That could be demographic groups, that can be relational groups like being a parent, that can of course be vocational groups, being an academic, being a football fan, could be all sorts of things. And the idea is that only one or maybe a select few are active in your mind at any one point in time. So you're not kind of all of these things together. In a way you are, but in the way you understand the norms, what you're supposed to do, you really just use one of these or maybe a couple of these identities. So I'm talking to you probably as an academic or a social psychologist right now, not as a parent. A parent would be really quite inappropriate right now. So it would be much more adaptive for me to talk like an academic and to act like an academic. So I'm using the group's norms and values as an academic, giving talks about research to convince you of the type of stuff that we are doing. And people have found in the lab lots and lots of effects of salience, of identity. So they make one identity salient or they make the opposite identity salient, and look at how does that affect voting behavior? How does it affect crowd behavior, and who sort of how you feel connected with other people? Does it affect who you are going to help and how good you feel in a crowd? It affects attitudes. So for instance, sexism. So even your sexism isn't constant. It depends on which group membership has been activated. Even your olfactory judgment, so what you smell, appears to be affected by the group membership that is activated, and even what you forget and what you remember. And there's loads and loads of other effects. So really what people have been doing is make a particular identity salient and then look at the effects. So you make a social context salient that you are in a social context that makes the salient identity active, and that then creates what we call prototypical behavior, which is behavior in line with the group's norms and values. And that's one form of behavior, of course, is the way you write.
Well, I think that we are missing.
Can you not see? Salvador? Hello, hello.
I can see it.
You can see it? Good.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, everybody's fine. Good. Excellent. It might just be Salvador as kind of, he said sometimes it drops him out, I think. Maybe that's what happened. Excellent. Good. So we basically say one prototypical behavior that you show is any kind of writing style that you have. And then we just turn it around and say, instead of saying salient identity affects your behavior, we say, if that is true, can we infer from that what identity is actually salient? So can we turn that around? And we do that because in a way, salience assessment has been lagging a little bit. So we can manipulate it, but we're not very good at measuring it in psychology. So a lot of the time people use self-reports as a kind of manipulation check, for instance. But the problem is if I ask you, which identity is salient right now, people tend to not be able to answer that. It's quite an abstract question. It's also meant to be quite an automatic process. So how could you even have any insight into that? The other problem is reactivity. So if we make the question quite specific, so we say, to what extent do you think of yourself as a student right now? Then I'm activating the category student. So I'm actually measuring something that I've just created. So that is a bit of a problem to measure it properly. So people have really used experimental paradigms to look at social categories and which are active, but of course that confines you to the lab. You can't really look at how do identities get activated, how do they interact in the natural world if you have to use quite a complicated experimental paradigm. So we start looking at computational approaches based on what our colleagues told us about being able to detect gender, detect age in language. And we found that actually that's quite a kind of popular thing to do nowadays, it appears. So people have started using linguistics and also content, so not just style, but also content, to classify text into different categories. So usually that's mutually exclusive groups. So male, female, young, old, Republican, Democrats. You can have ones where there's Christians versus atheists. So all sorts of groups that are in-group, out-group. So they are mutually exclusive groups. Now, the trouble with that is that it invites a lot of confounds. So these groups might differ because of different demographics. We know that Republicans and Democrats, for instance, differ in education, they differ in age, they differ in all sorts of personality variables. And so we don't know, is it really the activation of that group that drives the writing style, or is it just that these groups just have very different demographics that drive the writing style? And in the end of the day, because you can only be part of one of these groups but not the other, at the same time, you cannot look at shifts between different identities. So it's not really designed to assess salience. It's really just designed to assess whether you're more likely to be a member of one group rather than the other. So that didn't quite work for us, but we thought, hey, if text can do that sort of thing, then maybe we stand a bit of a chance also to detect identities. And that's the kind of tool that we created. It's called Automated Social Identity Assessment, short ASIA. And what we do instead of mutually exclusive groups is we use overlapping groups. So that could, for instance, and that's the case that I'm going to kind of use to convince you that this works, is, for instance, parents and feminists, right? So any person could be a parent and a feminist at the same time, or being an academic and a football fan. You can be lots of things at the same time in a way. And the idea is if salience only makes one category active in your mind, then we can tell which of these two identities was active based on the linguistics that you're using. Now, the advantage here is that because the same person can have both, we can then look at dynamic changes between them, which also helps us to control for any kind of stable characteristics, such as demographics and personality. So it controls for confounds. And we can use it as an indirect measure. So we can use it with naturally occurring data, so we don't have the problems of introspection or reactivity as with the other salience measures. And also it opens up a really, really wide variety of different stuff that you can use. Forum posts, historical text, newspaper, all sorts of things you can use depending on your research question. So we developed the ASIA toolkits as a team over about 6 years. So it took us quite a long time to sort of work it all out. And I'm trying to not bore you with all the details, how we validated it and cross-validated it and did all sorts of things. Basically, what we do is we use forum posts and lots of them. And then we run a classifier, like a logistic regression is probably the closest what psychologists are familiar with in terms of classification. You can throw the kitchen sink of machine learning at it, but funny enough, logistic regression does really, really well. We use style features, so they are grammatical features like pronouns, whether you use future tense or past tense, whether you use quite long intellectual words or short words, all sorts of these things. And we try to stay away from kind of content, because then it becomes quite trivial, because of course parents talk more about children than maybe feminists do. And we try to cross-validate it. That's when we only use posts from people who have posted in both forums. So we use forums as a kind of proxy for identity, and then see, does the person change their writing style with the pattern of the rest of the group, depending on in which forum they're posting. And then we go across platforms to make sure that it's nothing to do with, say, Mumsnet UK, but you can also find it on an American platform or on other platforms with different demographics. And then we ran an experiment where we just invited people who are both parents and feminists, according to their self-report. And then we asked half of them, think of yourself as a feminist right now. The other said, think of yourself as a parent right now. And then we had them write about particular topics so that we can control for topics. And we were the audience. So it was the academics as the audience. We said, nobody else gets to read your stuff, only us. So that it's not just an audience effect. They're not just adapting or accommodating to our language. And then we kind of try to apply it. And I come to that when we talk about development. See, I should have done that, shouldn't I? There. And in terms of results, you can then see that usually when you train a classifier, it comes out really, really well. It's about 90% accuracy. But then when you sort of start controlling for other factors, for demographics and things, it goes down. But what surprised us was how consistent it was at about 3 out of 4 correct classifications, and 0.76, that's a massive effect. So if you compare that, for instance, to a weight, if you want to say, we can take the weight of a person and tell whether it is a man or a woman, because they tend to have quite different weight ranges, you would actually only get a classification of around 0.58. So that's much lower. That's much closer to your guessing range of 0.5. So 0.72 is really, really high. And we can show that it's independent of topic, it's independent of audience, it's independent of the particular platform where you get the data from. So it seems to work really quite well. Mm. Usually people ask about linguistic features, sort of what's the kind of stuff that tells you if somebody talks like a parent or talks like a feminist. And actually we were surprised that it works I mean, it's always difficult because you would ideally want to predict that, and it's hard because you don't really know that much about these prototypes, but you can have a good guess. But at least to us, it looked like fairly logical what came out. So just to give you a few examples of the things that came out, above the red line is more feminist, below the red line is more parent. And if we start with the kind of more feminist ones, that would be things like the Luke indicator 6 letter. That means you have a word that has more than 6 characters. So fancy words like differentiate, linguistic, all these kind of long academic words. And feminists use them more than parents. They also tend to use more words to do with causality and insight. And they tend to use more words that are kind of neutral. So for instance, gender neutral pronoun they is much more common when a person, the same person, writes as a feminist than when they start writing as a parent. When they write as a parent, you have more inclusive language, you have more he's and she's and we's as pronouns, and you have more time words. So people tell things more as a kind of anecdotal style rather than a more sort of generalized argument, which makes sense when we think about what parents do and what feminists do. So does that make sense? But you can see there's also a huge range of other things that differentiate between the two groups, but it really is a pattern. So you can't just go and say, oh, if somebody uses a lot of intellectual words, probably they're a feminist. That would not make sense. And it would, for instance, not distinguish them from being an academic, because we tend to do the same thing as well. So you really have to take the whole pattern of it and not just sort of individual indicators. Are there any questions at this point? I can't see the chat box, I don't think. So Salvador, you might have to help me out here.
Yes, you can make your questions directly by opening your microphone or by writing in the text box that you have on top of your Teams window. You have any questions? Go ahead. I got one. First of all, so the way in which you train your algorithms for classifying this or that word into one identity or another is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the probability of each word fits a given category within a given context. I mean, within a given, I mean, you are not using only words separated, but I guess that you are using the words within a specific phrase that conveys a specific meaning, and based on that, that word fits into one category or another. Is that correct?
Way too complicated. What we do is much simpler than what you're suggesting. So we tried sort of phrases and really complicate things. It's called post tagging, where you can kind of look at, does the adverb come ahead of the article or God knows what. And that's well too complicated. So what we really do is we use the software Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count. That's a software by Pennebaker and his colleagues. And it's called a bag of words approach, where you really just count how many times did a person use he and or she in a paragraph that they wrote or in a forum post, any kind of text. And then you calculate the percentage compared to the full number of words that they used. So there might be, say, use 10% of the words that they used in their little paragraph were first person singular pronouns, right? Things like that. Or it categorizes whether a verb is future tense or past tense. So it doesn't have anything to do with meaning. There's no meaning. And we try to stay away from meaning. We try to stay away from content. It's really just basic linguistic style stuff, grammar use. Does the person use lots of adverbs? Does the person use a lot of long words? Does the person use a lot of past tense? That sort of thing. So really quite removed from meaning as far as possible. And then we use that like in a normal regression, you have predictors, right? Except our outcome is just not continuous, but it's just binary. So it basically just tries to say, if you know how many adverbs the person used, how many times they use the word they, how many times as a percentage they use long words, can you then tell with a sort of what kind of accuracy do you have telling whether that person is a parent or a feminist? And then you get a probability value, and if the probability is above 0.5, then depending how you did your categories, you get a feminist. If it's below 0.5, then you get a parent, or the other way around. That depends on your coding. And so the AUCs, when, hang on, if I can go back, if it lets me. The AUCs, zoop, these ones, they really tell you if you took a random post from the set of posts that you have, and you know for each post whether the person was a parent or a feminist, according to your manipulation or according to the particular forum they were posting in, what would be the probability that you get it right based on what you know about their writing style? Okay, so in our case, we usually get it right about 72% of the time. So 3 out of 4, we guess right based on their writing style, if they're a feminist or if they're a parent. Does that make sense? Is that roughly?
Yes, yes, perfect. Gary, do you have a question?
Quite a few, but just not just yet.
Fair enough. Keeping the suspense.
Yeah, formulating the good question. I got another one. So you built so far two different corpus of that comprises a category, right? You got a corpus specifically for parent and a corpus for feminist, right?
Yeah.
Have you built any other corpus right now?
Oh yeah, in terms of other identities, yeah. So we've got quite a lot, but not all of them validated. But I'm coming sort of to it a little bit. So we've got entrepreneur and libertarian. That's what Alicia sort of did, and that's published. We also look at recovery identity versus an addiction identity or a depression identity, and we're kind of validating that with experimental data at the moment to make sure that it's kind of not some other effect, that it's really the identities. And I come a little bit later when I talk about the groups. I also come to sort of, we have sort of 15 different groups where we compared all of them and then kind of looked at the similarities and differences. So there's quite a few that we've done, but at various levels of validation. So you might have to be sort of more or less careful about how you interpret that based on the data we have. But yeah, you can do it with basically any identities. We've not had any problems with any identities whatsoever, which was quite remarkable because we thought, maybe it just really works for parents and feminists, but it seems to work with anything really. So yeah, are there other questions? Otherwise I can just try to
yeah,
run out of time. Excellent. So basically we're saying that we can classify words into identities. So we think we can tell who you are from the way in which you write. And it works for, and that was exactly your question, it works for all sorts of different groups. So for instance, Alicia found that we can tell entrepreneurs and libertarians apart. Again, she had around 0.72. That seems to be our magic number. 0.72 is 3 out of 4 we can get correct. There's lots of difficulties with that we still have to iron out. So for instance, it's a relative measure rather than an absolute measure. So if you, for instance, think of yourself as an academic, and then you do our little tool, and then we can really only classify you as a parent or a feminist. We cannot say, is a parent identity active without the feminist identity or without any other kind of counter identity. Partly that makes sense. It's just easier with classification. If you can classify two things apart from each other, that's kind of mathematically much easier than having to do some sort of absolute measure. The other reason might be more theoretical, because in social identity terms, we think of groups as, or the values of the group shifting slightly from situation to situation, depending on the comparison context. So for instance, when you compare feminists with parents, then you could say maybe the intellectual aspect is what stands out for feminists against the comparison group of parents, which is sort of known to not be the sort of most intellectual group around. We kind of like to dumb things down a little bit. But when you then compare feminists with academics, then of course saying, oh, feminists are really intellectual is kind of not a particularly clever thing to do, because academics also think of themselves as quite intellectually gifted. So then maybe it's the emotional side that stands out. Academics are meant to talk in sort of quite neutral terms, academic style. We usually teach our students to sort of not give us very opinionated words, to keep it very sort of, you know, academically, factually neutral. Whereas, of course, as a feminist, the idea is that you're kind of doing politics. So you have to use a bit of emotions to rally the troops. So there you would then have quite a different differences between these two groups. So it makes sense to be a relative measure, but of course it restricts you in what you can do and what you can conclude. And at this point, it's a binary classifier. So we're trying to branch out that you can do more than just a comparison between two groups, because in some contexts, it might be more interesting to branch out to other groups as well. But so far, what we've done with them is we've looked at all sorts of dynamic aspects of identity, because we felt that actually the literature doesn't give us very much on them. So for instance, we look at how new identities develop. And the example I picked here that we've done in the past is look at a parent identity and how it develops in first-time parents and how it relates to mental health. And I did that research with Ella Hale, who's my postdoc, during my fellowship, and Heather O'Main, who is a clinical psychologist who specializes in perinatal mental health. And so to give you a little bit of background on that, perinatal depression is astonishingly common. So 12 to 18% of mothers and fathers experience moderate to severe depression. It's defined as depression in the first year after a child is born. And people usually report difficulties with bonding with a newborn child or feeling quite inadequate as a parent to there's also a lot of anxiety, so people feel that they might actually do harm to their child or neglect the child because they just cannot cope with the situation very well. And that makes sense that then sort of parent identity seems to be a little bit implicated in this kind of process. And colleagues at the University of Queensland have found in a cross-sectional survey study, and that's really the only indication we have as far as we know, that people who identified more as a mother after birth had less postpartum depression. But as I said, it's kind of correlational, cross-sectional. There's also sort of in the nursing literature on maternal role attainment or becoming a mother, BAM is the kind of short version, and they've kind of done a lot of qualitative work in particular to understand when do parents think of themselves as parents or moms as moms, and is that related to mental health? And they usually pin it down to saying, oh, it usually develops around 4 months after birth. And that seems quite late. I mean, that seems quite sort of, you already have the kid for 4 months, and then you kind of clock that now you're a mom. So that seems quite late in the day. So we thought maybe we can have a look at online forum posts. There's lots and lots of these pregnancy forums, and get a little bit of an idea of when do people start to at least write like a parent, right? Since we have the classifier, we might as well use it. So we have a sample from NetMoms UK, so not Mumsnet where it was trained on, but NetMoms. I know, sounds the same to most people, but it's not the same. And we included people where we could tell the due date from the posts, where they were active enough that we can include them, where they mentioned that it was their first pregnancy, because of course, identity development might be quite different if you already have a child. And we sort of decided that they had some form of perinatal mental health issues if they had posted in a dedicated forum on perinatal mental health on NetMoms. And you can sort of look the user ID up, if you will, and you can look, do they report symptoms like diagnosis? Do they even take medication for depression or anxiety after birth? And we included them. That might be underestimating things, because of course, people might just not go in the forum and talk about it. It's still really, really stigmatized to have any sign of depression or anxiety after birth. But we found that 55 out of our 326 first-time mothers had signs of perinatal mental health issues. That's around 17%, and that kind of chimes with a kind of 10 to 18% from the literature that I mentioned earlier. But of course, we don't know. So in terms of results, the first thing that we looked at was in a kind of validation approach to our classifier. Do people actually differ in the way we would expect? And we would expect that around 3 months after birth, which is usually when postnatal depression is diagnosed, that's when our two groups should really differ. And with growth curve modeling, we can show there is an interaction between time and postnatal depression, and around 3 months after birth, there's significant gap between them. So around birth, and that was already the first surprise, you can see on the gray line, they're pretty much exactly the same. And then if you call them healthy moms, they kind of go up in their parent identity strength. and those who develop postnatal depression, they go down, as you would expect. Now, the interesting thing is what happens before birth. Can we say something interesting, or is it just exactly the same for both of them? And we were really surprised to see that actually they differ even more than after birth in a way. So you can see that those moms who don't develop any sort of problems, as far as we can tell, they have a slight dip around sort of the second trimester, but they're actually really, really high already right from the start. They seem to have the parent identity activated. They write like parents. Whereas those who later on develop postnatal depression symptoms, they start really late. So around the second trimester is when it starts to pick up. And we can see they are kind of actually getting there around birth, the same as the healthy ones, but then they seem to lose it again, which is a bit of a puzzle, but it's definitely an interesting puzzle that they differ so much already quite early on in the pregnancy. We think in terms of the postnatal data, that's reassuring because it in a way validates our tool, because we find the pattern that we would expect to find in terms of identity and postnatal depression. Antenatally, that was the interesting one. Second trimester seems to be sort of showing that people are picking up, but before we have the big differences, which might indicate a failure of them to develop an identity early on. And maybe then the identity is not as strong, or there might be other issues with identity, why they lose it again after birth. Or it might be an issue of cognitively accessing, of having the parent identity salient when the context, such as a parenting forum, would actually require it to be salient. So it might just be that they start thinking of other identities when they talk to other parents than their parent identity, that there are some sort of distractors. And that might be a work identity or other identities that they find difficult to fit around being a parent. So at the moment, we're running a follow-up survey study where we also ask pregnant women to give us access to their online forum posts. It's quite difficult to recruit people. So if you know anybody who's pregnant right now, do let me know, because we really want to have a lot more data on the situation surrounding and psychologically, but also sort of just the social context of people that might lead to this particular pattern and whether we can replicate it in the survey sample. But the interesting thing is we think that we can say something about the development of identities over the kind of longer term, over 9 months in the case of, or even 12 months when you go postnatally for parents. The next thing that we looked at was social identity switches, but maybe I just quickly ask if anybody's got questions about the development side of things. I can hear noises, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think that. No, sorry, Sarah. I think that something is wrong with your microphone because we can hear you. If you type it,
Yeah.
would be better.
Oh yes, now we can hear you.
Okay. There you go.
Okay, so what was the question?
Yeah.
Hello?
Hello?
Yeah. Yeah. We can
Yeah,
hear
I
you.
said, what was the question?
We lost you again.
Maybe if you have a question, sort of keep it for the discussion in a bit. It's not very long.
Yeah, I think she's gonna connect.
And then, or just to try to type.
Yeah.
There you go. Yeah, just continue. I just continue.
Yeah.
Excellent. Good. So Anna Thin, who's my PhD student at the sort of bottom left corner, and my colleague Aurelio Lavridge, who's a cognitive psychologist, we started to think about social identity switches. So that is when you actually sort of switch from one identity, say as a parent, to a work identity. And how effective are we doing that? Can we control whether we switch or not? And what Anna found was really quite astonishing, because we came from a background of saying maybe it is a bit like task switching. So when you switch from, I don't know, making yourself a cup of tea while trying to read a book and the kids are trying to talk to you, you have to kind of switch between different tasks. And that can come with performance issues like longer reaction times, more error rates, or these kind of beautiful cognitive indices of things going well or not going so well. And so we thought, if there is kind of performance issues with task switching, maybe we have the same issues with identity switches. Maybe it's costly. right? If you have to keep switching between, and that would certainly sort of chime with, I think, what parents felt during homeschooling, during lockdown. You've got the kids running around, you have to try to do your work, you have to constantly switch between all sorts of different things. And it felt really definitely very tiring. So we thought, oh, surely there might be a bit of an effect. But actually what we find is there's no effect. People are absolutely marvelously effective switching between identities. You go down to milliseconds and they can still do it. There's a task switch effect, but there doesn't seem to be any identity switch effect. So it seems to be a really automated, efficient process, which works because that is what self-characterization theory has said all along, that it's a fluid process of switching. So using all these kind of fancy task switching paradigms, we don't find anything much. Now, the question that you can then ask is, if it's that automatic, do people have any control over it? I mean, I'm told by Aurelie not to use the word automatic quite so liberally, so forgive me for not being good, but it's basically the fluidity of it, the kind of the speed with which you can switch. Can you actually avoid it? Can you control your identity? And that's what she did in her next study, where we use the linguistic indicators. That's why I'm kind of telling you about this study, because we actually use the parent versus feminist classifier here. And what she did was she first activated a parent identity in everybody using a typical salience manipulation. And then we randomly divide people into experimental and control group, as you do. And the experimental group, we asked, please keep thinking, try as much as you can, think of yourself as a parent. And in the first study, we just asked them nicely. In the second study, we thought, okay, maybe we have to just throw the kitchen sink at it and pay people if they can do it. So we told them, if you can manage to stay in the parent identity, we pay you a bonus. So this is really important to us. We will give you extra money. And then in the control group, they didn't get any prompt. They were given another reason how they could earn extra money. So it was still ethical and fair. And then they both had to do a task, which was write about a feminist identity topic. So they had to write about something, I think, along the lines of women are still treated as sex objects, discuss. Right? And that's pretty a feminist thing to do, to talk about that sort of thing. And then we had self-report measures, so typical salience measures, which have the issues of reactivity and introspection. So we said, gave them items like, I thought of myself as a parent, I thought of myself as a feminist, please rate it from not at all to very much, as you do. And then we also used our classifier to classify them based on the text. And what we found was that in the self-report measure, of course, before the prompted switch, so just after the parent identity manipulation, absolutely everybody said, yeah, I'm totally thinking of myself as a parent. I know what you want me to do, and I'm totally doing it. And after the switch, after they had to write about the feminist topic, they were asked again. And in the control group, they said, oh, I'm not quite thinking of myself so much as a parent. Not as much as before, in any case. Whereas the people in the experimental group that we told we're going to pay you if you keep thinking of yourself as a parent, they absolutely went like, yeah, totally. I totally thought of myself as a parent. Women as sex objects, yeah, that's totally parenting. But in the linguistic style, we saw an absolute switch. While during the kind of, when they wrote about the manipulation stuff, they wrote like parents. But then when they wrote about the feminist text, and you can see that here in the graph, there was no difference whatsoever between control group and experimental group. And they were definitely under the 0.5 line. So they were around 0.1, I think, which is a really, really strong feminist style compared to 1, which would be a perfect parenting style. So you can see they're sitting there right at the bottom and in equal measures. So they were both drawn towards the feminist identity style, no matter what they actually told us in the self-report. So we think we can also not just say nice things about long-term development of identities, but we can also say something about really, really short-term quick switches between identities. And we think what we find in the study so far is that there's evidence of quite limited control over identity switches. People just switch. They can't stop it, even if we motivate them, if we pay them extra. So one of the next questions is about well-being and performance. So are there individual differences? Is it a good thing to be able to switch effectively? Is it a bad thing if it means you don't have any control? Could you learn the control if you needed to? And does sort of interacting with lots of digital stuff actually make us switch a lot more. So when you scroll through your Facebook timeline, you might kind of have to switch identities about 5 or 6 times per minute. And does that do something to us that we have to do all these switches, or is it that automatic that really it doesn't matter at all? So we think there's quite still a lot of questions to be answered around that. Other questions around the switching? As of yet. I don't know. Because I'm trying to wrap it up a little so that we're not running out of time, because then we have sort of about 15, 20 minutes of discussion time. Is that right?
15. 15, it's okay.
15, yes. I can do Alicia's stuff in 2 minutes. So this is Alicia. She is just finished her PhD with me and Richard Everson, who's a computer scientist. And she did this fancy stuff on entrepreneurs and libertarians. But what she also did was look at how does the linguistic style reflect on the group's values? Does it tell us something interesting? So if we assume that the norms and values of a group affect the writing style of a group member in a systematic way, can you again turn it around and say, does the shared style, the kind of pattern that we detect, say something about the underlying values of the group? And does that mean groups that have similar values have a similar writing style, and groups that are quite different have a different writing style? And can that be changed? So if the group changes in their values or in who they think they are, does the writing style of the group members change? So what we did was we first replicated a study by Deux and colleagues from 1995, way back, where they found 5 different types of groups: political groups, stigmatized groups, religious ethnic groups, vocational groups, and relational groups. And they did that by asking people to just kind of cluster groups together. And people weren't necessarily in-group members, they were just sort of people who might or might not have been in-group member, and they just said, okay, these groups are similar and these groups are different. So now we're trying to replicate that, but based on the linguistic style that actual group members on Reddit, actually, what do they do, and how does that reflect these kind of different group types? Can we replicate that? So Alicia tried to pick roughly the same groups that Deux et al. Had sort of published about. And Reddit is this kind of fantastic forum where I think they have 100,000 different forums for roughly any interest you could possibly have. And we found quite a lot of these kind of groups, so 15 altogether. And again, we do our pairwise AGA models. And then once you do that, you have a similarity or dissimilarity matrix. And if you have lots of fun with Python, then you can create multi-dimensional scaling. And that comes out like this. So it clusters things a little bit like factor analysis, really. It clusters things together that are more similar and creates a distance between them if they're different. And what you can see here, and it really surprised us, was that we pretty much replicate the 5 types of groups. We found 4 clusters. Mathematically speaking, there are 4 clusters because the demographic and the political groups seem to fall together. So we have conservatives being really close to feminists, which seems a bit odd given the kind of goals of the groups, but they are definitely all political demographic groups. They're quite different from our relationship groups, like being parents or being a partner to someone. The stigmatized groups, we had drinking, people who tried to stop drinking, homelessness and transgender, and vocational groups such as teachers, entrepreneurs, and sales. I'm sure you will ask me, and do if you want, why are teachers and homeless people so close together? I can't give you a very good answer, but I could try. But we can definitely see the kind of 4 clusters. Now, what she then did was she correlated that with values that you can also extract from text, and then we come to much more sort of content-based things. But there's natural language tools that can measure Schwarz's value dimensions. And then you can correlate that with the X and the Y axis. And basically what we find is that the top right corner, so both X and Y correlate with benevolence, right? So you have the kind of nice people in the relationship groups. And if you go down the Y axis, you come to the more achievement-based groups, which really is our vocational groups, which makes me think a lot of sense. And if you go to the left, so the kind of negative values on the X axis, you come to universalism and conformity, which again makes sense when you look at collective action groups. Right? So we thought that actually kind of weirdly makes a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. And then we asked about change. So we said, okay, what about groups that actually changed? So for instance, if you take transgender, it kind of sat in our stigmatized cluster, which in a way makes sense. But of course, transgender or LGBTQ plus has changed a lot over the past 10 years. And can we see that they actually kind of change from this kind of more hidden away, stigmatized group to people who are trying to sort of gain their rights and to stand up for themselves and create sort of much more of a collective action and political group. And so what Alicia did was look at it separated by years. It started on Reddit in 2011, so that was still quite a small group, and it's a bit of an outlier here. But when you start 2012 to 2019, you get this really lovely right to left movement of the transgender group from much more the kind of right-hand side stigmatized group, and the more sort of it turns towards, I think, bluish green, you go much more towards the sort of collective action side of things. But you can see it's super small steps. I mean, these are tiny, tiny baby steps. They are kind of still quite 3 to 5 miles from the collective action groups, but you can definitely sort of see how it correlates with the x-axis negatively. So we think it does reflect change in a group self-view in a way that you could possibly expect, like in the transgender case, where you move from stigmatized to more collective action. And that's really kind of already pretty much it, because we have 10 minutes left. There's obviously difficulties by just using Reddit groups, no doubt about it. But we think that we can make a fairly good case that linguistic style reflects social identities, both long-term as well as kind of in-the-moment switches and group-level changes to a social group. And we think it opens up for social psychologists all sorts of data using naturally occurring data in the wild, so real-world data that people didn't even write for us as researchers, but wrote to each other on forums and on social media. So you can potentially access hard-to-reach groups like opioid addicts, pregnant women, but of course you have to think a lot about ethics. And it might help answer questions about social groups that so far we haven't been able to take out of the lab as much. So that is really kind of my pitch to you. And I'm ready for all sorts of questions.
Thank you so much, Miriam. If any of you have any questions, this is the time. Go ahead, open your mics.
No question.
Yes.
I don't have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
I don't have a question. I understand everything she said.
Oh,
I love that. I think Gary might have a question.
Okay. Okay. Let's go with those ones who had the yeah, Gary. Let's go with Gary.
Okay. Hi. So I have a couple of questions, but the first one. So you're basing the natural language processing on Liwick or Liwick or however people pronounce it. I've heard a few pronunciations, Penny Baker stuff. Is that the core of your NLP, or is there have you developed that over the years?
Yeah, so we tried to develop. So the folks at UCL and Imperial, they're really keen. Everybody is really keen to get away from Luke, partly because they have to pay a license fee, and computer science folks hate that sort of thing. But also because it seemed really simplistic. It's just a bag of words approach. It's really just dumb counting of words. So for instance, when we do our depression versus addiction identity, what you find is that positive emotion words are really predictive of the depression group compared to the addiction group, which just goes to show how dumb the program is, because when you look at the text that people write, they write things like, I haven't been happy in 15 years, or I haven't experienced any joy since my husband died. So it counts happy and it counts joy, but it doesn't understand the negation with it. So it's really just dumb words. So they tried to, we had a couple of master students who tried to sort of improve on that by using pos tagging, by using all sorts of other libraries. There's kind of IBM Watson, but they didn't really improve on anything. The same as with machine learning, we use logistic regression happily. Alicia and Richard, they threw extra random trees, extra random forests. I think we're gone beyond the trees, we're with the forests. We have support vector machines, we've got neural networks at it. It doesn't improve things, it's just exactly the same. And my advantage for me is Luke and logistic regression mean I can interpret the thing. So I can show you these kind of graphs where it says feminists use more they than parents, because it's a linear thing, it's not a complicated vector machine. So for me, it has advantages to keep it simple, and we've tried and it hasn't improved. That's the short of it.
No, I was going to mean that there's so much stuff in there in NLP, but it's interesting you said that it doesn't improve. My thinking was that, well, there would be lots of room for improvement.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, we just might have not thrown the right thing at it. So any ideas are very welcome. We're kind of very happy to experiment, because once you start thinking of maybe diagnosing perinatal depression early, right, then you're kind of looking at diagnostics rather than group level stuff that we do as researchers. And then you really want to go well beyond your 0.72. Then you want to be somewhere in your 80s or 90s, ideally. So anything that helps, very welcome. Absolutely.
Okay, I don't know, there are other questions. I have a second question about ethics, as well, which I'm sure you always get asked this. So I saw from your paper there that you're getting informed consent from the social media people, where most of the time, was that, or?
No, we don't. We don't.
Okay.
So that would be a lot of people to ask. The thing that BPS gives us, and also APA, is that it basically considers it, at this point at least, and that might be a discussion worth having, public behavior. And for public behavior, it's essentially, so we are really restricted by our ethics team to say only use stuff where it's already anonymous, so don't use Twitter. But there's tons of people in the computation social science who use Twitter feeds, and even Facebook, where we all know that in Facebook people are not keeping things private because they don't know how, or it's confusing. So we're staying away from things like that and go with Reddit or Mumsnet or NetMums. We did ask Mumsnet and NetMums because they are holding the IP to it, essentially, or the copyright to it. So we asked them very nicely if we could kind of download their data, but not the individual users. And we have to never publishing what people write.
Yeah. Okay, that brings me to the second part of the question is, well, maybe the third part of the question, but the second part of the ethics question, which is, if these two techniques are real, and psychologists think about ethics. You've already touched on this with computer scientists not thinking about ethics half so much. We think a lot about ethics, but what about Facebook and Cambridge Analytica and people who can use this for targeted advertising? I'm not saying that you shouldn't do your research, but have you thought about uses that this could be put to target voters, or? Yeah,
we put I mean, it was even to the extent that I said to Mark when we sort of first started thinking about this, it's like, I'm not going to do this because I can totally see how this can go so badly wrong. But then we are like, maybe it's just, if you're not, I mean, Mark always comes with, if you're not doing it, somebody else will do it. It's like, oh, yeah, that's always a bad one. But we thought, okay, if we do it, then at least we have the chance to maybe steer it in the direction we want to, like looking at mental health things, looking at things that you can use it for good. And we put quite a lengthy sort of thing in our paper for the Asia model to say, please consider ethics, and these are the kind of things that you really, really should be thinking about. Well, yeah, in the end, you can't really stop people from misusing it. But our team at Exeter, they're really keen on licensing stuff at the university. Probably if you've ever kind of done any of this kind of tool stuff, universities love licensing things. And there is an opportunity in licensing to say, we only license it to people who are academics, or we only license it in that sort of way. But I really have no clue about licensing. So I'm trying, that's a journey I'm taking at the moment to find out how to use it.
I suspect people with bad intentions would just go with the license anyway. So
yeah, and that's certainly true. But at least, I mean, you would think that Facebook and others, I mean, they're getting held to account slightly more than they used to, not as much as they should. But if they start doing things that are quite illegal in terms of licensing, then, but yeah, it's down to, can you actually enforce it? You can't really. Yeah, it's definitely a worry. I'm absolutely with you.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we got just a few more minutes. So, Kerry, you're there. Kerry, go ahead with your question.
Hi. Yes. A couple of quick ones, hopefully. I'm a psychology student. I'm very interested in the link between language and identity and social psychology. So this is really interesting to me. Have you looked at any corpora related to different identities in sort of offender rehabilitation, like before and after? And also, have you looked at any corpora for sort of extreme groups, whether it's like extreme right wing or any other extremists? Because that's sort of it's always a huge topic. And then my other question is, did you notice any kind of blurring of the identities as a result of the impact of lockdowns? Because obviously, you know, parents were working from home, everything became a little bit more relaxed, and did that sort of impact the results that you saw at all? Thank you.
Yeah, these are really great questions. So for the first one, sort of what kind of groups have we looked at? We haven't looked at sort of offenders and rehabilitation. It kind of comes up as identities as we start looking more at addiction. So I'm working with Celia Morgan, who's got the Awaken project in Exeter, where she's a neuroscientist. So she looks at how giving people drugs helps them to deal with their alcohol, which seems kind of quite slightly bonkers to me, but it seems to work quite well. And she talks about people having epiphanies, but then they want to get away from things like being an addict. They want to get away from being offenders. So a lot of people are actually sort of in her sample have an offending history. I think it comes with the territory in a way, but we haven't looked at it explicitly, and it's definitely been an interesting thing to do. I know of colleagues in Edinburgh who use qualitative data to look at that sort of thing. And for extremist groups, that definitely comes up every single time. That seems to be like the hobby of anybody who's security or computer science related to look at extremist groups. So at the moment, we've got Crest Money. That's sort of folks in Lancaster hold that pot of money. And that's sort of Mark and a colleague. And we look at hybrid identities of eco-fascists. But we've only just started, so I can't tell you anything much about it. But the idea is to look at the sort of ecological part of the identity and the fascist part of the identity. And these people seem to be hiding the fascist aspects by basically infiltrating eco communities, people talking about climate change, so that they cannot be closed down by Reddit. So that's quite an interesting area. Basically, based on what we just discussed about the ethics part, that's the reason why I try to stay away from the kind of more juicy things like extremist groups, to be honest with you, because that can go wrong so horribly, so quickly. But yeah, it's definitely one people are interested in. And hang on, the second part of the question was, help me out. Oh, blurring during the pandemic. So far, and that's in a way the beauty of naturally occurring data, is we've kind of avoided the pandemic data because we're still trying to answer our initial questions. So we've kind of just go back before 2019, as you saw with Alicia's data. So she makes an explicit point about saying we basically only looked at data before the pandemic, because there is that, on the one hand, worry, but maybe also interesting bit about the pandemic having affected how people think about their identities, certainly. But we haven't looked at it explicitly, so it's definitely an interesting one to do.
Sorry, Miriam, because we have more questions, and there are also many people here. I just share with your email, in the chat box. So to all those people who are still with us and you have more questions, you can write to her directly. In the meantime, I think we've reached our limit. So. Thank you very much, Miriam, for joining us. This was far interesting, and this is a new methodology for us that we are doing research on psychology. And hopefully we see you here again in some point.
Brilliant. That'd be brilliant. I hope we see some of you maybe in Exeter sometime.
Yeah, sometime. I have to say that this has been recorded, so the recording is going to be available eventually in the school website. So thank you very much for all the people who joined us today, and have a nice afternoon. You too. Thank you so much. And I definitely try to get back to everybody with answers to your questions. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.